Okay, I think in the interests of time, we can make a start. Thanks so much to everyone for coming to join us this morning. My name is Freddie Carver, and I'm the Director of the Humanitarian Policy Group, HPG, at ODI Global. And really, it's a massive honor for me to be moderating this session today. We have a truly stellar panel of speakers to talk to, I think, an issue that is of such critical importance. It was woven through all the conversations, I think, that I was part of yesterday around the Congress on this issue of IHL and declining norms and how the humanitarian sector responds. I want to start by just quickly introducing the panel, explaining who we have in front of us today. First, I want to introduce Her Excellency Dr. Fatou Bensouda, a Gambian lawyer and international jurist who, since 2002, has been the Gambian High Commissioner to the United Kingdom, but I think is best known for her role with the International Criminal Court as the chief prosecutor between 2012 and 2021. And I understand from talking to Fatou just now, the recent recipient of a Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Law Association in Nigeria. Welcome, Fatou, and thank you so much for joining us today. Then we have thank you. We have Professor Sultan Barakat, a globally recognized authority on conflict, humanitarian response and recovery. He's the Professor of Conflict and Humanitarian Studies at Hamad bin Khalifa University in Qatar, and also an honorary professor at the University of York. And the list of organizations and institutions and countries with whom he's held senior academic and advisory roles is too long to list now. Again, Dr. Sultan, thank you very much. Then we have Dr. Lina Gong, assistant professor and program director of the BA in International Relations at the Jean Jarton Liverpool University in Suzhou in China. The focus of her research is on humanitarian affairs, China-Southeast Asia relations, and non-traditional security in Asian environments. She was previously a research fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Malaysia, where she worked with the government of Singapore, ASEAN, and the UN. Again, welcome very much, Lina. And last, but very much not least, Dr. Cordula Duruga, the Chief Legal Officer and Head of the Legal Division at the International Committee of the Red Cross. She leads the ICRC's efforts to uphold, implement, and develop international humanitarian law, and she's been with the ICRC since 2005. Finally, welcome, Cordula. So I think the panel speaks for itself in terms of its experience, its skills, and the diversity of its views. So I'm going to keep my introduction really to a minimum. But just a couple of words to frame the conversation that we're going to have. And maybe actually the best framing was given yesterday morning by Hans-Jörg Strohmeyer from OCHA, who I think in that keynote session, one of the phrases that stood out for me was that he said, "No one gives a rat's ass about international law." So I think maybe that's a good place to start with our conversation this morning. I think in the conversations, and there are many of them, about how the political environment globally is changing and how the approach to norms and to IHL is changing, it's always important to remember that there are many people around the world, many communities, many populations, for whom international law has never delivered and who have never felt protected by the notion of international law. But at the same time, the story of the last 80 years of global relations has been one of an extraordinary attempt to create this international normative framework, building on many centuries of previous experience. And a framework that was upheld, at least in theory, by the major powers of the world to some extent. And I think it's unarguable that in recent years, we've seen an extent to which those major powers that have been responsible for protecting this framework have increasingly operated by ignoring them. If we think about contexts like Sudan, like Gaza, like Ukraine, most recently in the Middle East, Tamam yesterday talked about the fact that within the last couple of years, there are at least 2 widely recognized genocidal campaigns going on. The extent to which these norms and these frameworks are under threat is undoubtedly very significant. And this has a huge impact on the humanitarian sector. It's always important to say it's not the fault of the humanitarian sector, that's clear, but the humanitarian sector needs to understand the extent to which we're bound up in them. There's always been a tension between meeting people's basic needs in the crisis, in the context of crisis, and also seeking to protect their rights. And I think when the threats to those rights become more extreme, that presents a challenge to humanitarians. And if we think about a lot of the discussions here that have been happening over the last 2 days in other settings like this, we talk a lot about placing people at the center of humanitarian action, putting more local actors, actors who are close to the ground, in positions of authority and power. What do we know about what communities' most basic and urgent priorities are in context? It's safety and security. We have plenty of evidence for that. So what does that mean for humanitarians that struggle to manage these kind of political questions? And this raises really serious questions around legitimacy, around access, around how we justify our work and how we find space for our work. And those questions are both strategic and they're also very real on the operational side as well. So how do we navigate this complex space? So that's, I think, the frame for the conversation we want to have today. We're going to have two rounds of discussion with the panel before hopefully having some time to hear from the audience as well. We're going to start by focusing on what is the nature of this challenge that we face and how does it look from different perspectives. And then hopefully we're going to talk a bit more about what do we do about it. So to start us off, I want to turn to you, Sultan, and reflecting, I mean, you're based in Doha, reflecting on what has been happening in the Gulf in the last few months. I'd love to hear how these questions look from your perspective. Are we witnessing a structural shift in the relationship between power and humanitarian values? And what does that mean for humanitarian practice?
Thank you so much, Freddie, and thank you for inviting me to speak here today. I think the shift has been happening gradually over the last maybe two decades or so. And I would, if I were to ask when did it really start, I'd probably say around 9/11, when we all started to tolerate a little by little that some people do not deserve the humanitarian response or action or protection simply because they've been labeled as evil or they've been taken as terrorists and so on. That is fine. That moment, I think, has started to compromise on our ideals and our standings. And unfortunately, a lot of humanitarian actors went along with that pattern. Until today, in fact, those of you who know Syria, for example, well, or northern Iraq, will know about the camps that still are occupied by the so-called ISIS families. Some of those were children at the age of 2 or 3 or just born. Now they are young men and women living in isolated circumstances and with no or very little care, just enough to keep them alive. And I think that gradual erosion of norms that we collectively have allowed out of fear of terrorism and out of fear that has been placed in our hearts by the very few has led us to where we are today. And the greatest demonstration of that has been the genocide in Gaza. I think the actions that were allowed in Gaza, or the way we turned a blind eye to it, is really the peak of having lost our humanity collectively and having really compromised on a lot of the norms that we had agreed to. Why I say Gaza, not necessarily Sudan, although Sudan is as ugly. Gaza, because it was carried out by states, not just Israel, but also backed up by the United States, the superpower, and then many other states took a position where they backed it up. In Sudan, you could always say, well, these are people who are fighting each other. It's a civil war. They don't understand. It's blah, blah. You know, I'm not justifying it, but I think the fact that states have started to demonstrate to us that these norms do not apply equally to everybody. You must understand that when power dictates, power wins. So you have to respect where our power comes from. And this, of course, builds on what Russia did in Ukraine, and now what Russia will do further in Ukraine, and what China may be doing elsewhere, and so on, because now they open this gateway of lowliness or power is right that I think we're all ultimately going to suffer from. Obviously, those who rely on the law will suffer most, and I'm not a legal expert. We'll hear more from the legal experts in a minute. But small countries like Qatar and many others around the world, and medium power countries, they rely on the law to protect their sovereignty. This is how they've been created. This is what they need. There you find them almost always principled and wanting to protect the law, wanting to protect the international institutions that have generated the law and so on. Those that feel that they could be above the law, either because they have the power or because they can intimidate everybody else from speaking out, or because they can stall processes within the UN circles, give less, I think, concern, particularly to the international humanitarian law at the moment. Now, few things have also advanced that made things more complicated, aside from the compromise in our moral stand on who to protect and where to protect and who is a human, who's less a human, and so on, is the incredible advancement in technology. And I say this with, again, reflecting on what happened in Gaza, but also what happened in Lebanon immediately after, and what took just now, or taking place in Iran. The incredible implementation and use of artificial intelligence and software to target people based on their phone number and to kill them regardless of the fact that in the same block there will be 20 other families, civilians, innocent, that doesn't matter. We need to get these people. And the speed in which it's done simultaneously, like the attack on that Israel did with the pagers in Lebanon. 4,500 victims instantly, regardless of their political stand or their enmity to the Israelis, and everyone who stood by them at the moment, be it a child, a woman, whoever. And we saw a similar campaign in Iran recently. And I think that is something that we should really keep us from sleeping, because it is coming, and it's going to be stronger and stronger and stronger in the way forward. The second, which I find also very worrying, is that the very United Nations that created that norm since the Second World War and tried to protect it, is now under incredible pressure, not just to be dismantled and weakened. And all the UN agencies, one by one, they've eroded their funding. The latest is WHO and others, UNRWA for the Palestinians and so on. But it's under risk of being replaced. And I think we should look very, very carefully at this Board of Peace that was created by Trump in the last few months. This Board of Peace, although it was built on the ruin of Gaza, in fact, if you read the charter, it does not mention Gaza. It has declared an individual as the president or chair of this board for life, and it has had now more than 60 countries joining the board. And they're still trying to recruit and bully other countries into joining this board. So in a way, it's becoming a mini UN without norms, without any agreements, bypassing a lot of things. And the worst thing from the UN perspective is somehow it got passed through the UN Security Council as one instrument to sort out Gaza. But today, Trump is using it to sort out the war with Iran. And this is why Pakistan out of nowhere, was identified as a mediator. I don't know when was the last time Pakistan dealt in mediation. But Pakistan, because it brought the weight of the Muslim world behind this board, and of course, Trump communicates well with power, and he likes the generals, and so he turned a blind eye on all their history. And they've become his partners in peace, and now we are working together to deliver peace under the board of peace. And the last, I think, and I'll stop here, maybe I'll come back later, I don't want to take too much time, is the way we have started to conflate killing and peacemaking, simultaneously, that we can do both things without being questioned. And what worries me from a humanitarian perspective is that the humanitarian agencies, whether they like it or not, have become instruments in the hands of those powers operating within those fields. Partly because maybe of funding constraints, and more humanitarian agencies around the world have become dependent on on support coming from governments or UN agencies. Less and less are totally independent in their funding. And partly because we are really deeply concerned and we want to help and we want access. And you will only get access if you keep your mouth shut. So you need access, you need to keep quiet, you need to go in, you have to work, and so on. And the combination of these two have led us into a situation where we have accepted, in the name of helping others, we have accepted to be part of a very complex, I think, condition at the moment that ultimately is doing more harm than good. And it is very important, and I'm really, really pleased that we're having this conversation here at this moment in the Congress. It's very important to address this head-on and see what does it mean for us moving forward. Do we need to become more vocal? Do we need to ask for more pressure on our governments? Do we need to ask for more tax on weapons? I've been saying this for years, nobody agrees with it, but I still think those who made the 1% in the world, who made now billions over the last 3 years, they should be taxed. And that tax should come to the humanitarian because of the damage they're causing, very similar to the environmental tax that we have successfully imposed on some industries, including the air polluters around the world. If we continue to say, oh no, we're neutral, we don't do weapons, we don't talk about this, we're going to be totally irrelevant, because they are going to continue in this way. And I'm afraid we are living in a world at the moment where power rules.
Thank you very much indeed. A fantastic overview. And I think a number of threads in there that we want to pick up. I'm struck by your last point there. I think actually we heard a very similar point in the previous session from the chair, who was arguing that as the shift from overseas development assistance into defense budgets goes, that should include the costs of dealing with the consequences of war. I think it's a strong argument. And we'll come back to you, Sultan. I want to turn to you, Cordula. And really, I mean, the core mission of the ICRC, put simply, is to alleviate human suffering in conflict and uphold minimum standards of humanity without pursuing political interests. In the context we've been hearing about, what do you see as the greatest challenges that the ICRC faces in this mission today? Where are you struggling most, both on the ground and at the policy level?
Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you to the organizers, to the German Red Cross, our partners here in Geneva, in Germany, but also to all others for inviting us on this panel, and to speak particularly also about indeed the international humanitarian law aspect of these conflicts. But you were asking what the greatest challenges are, and I think just to sort of set the scene, and very much agreeing with Sultan in many of his points, particularly the description of conflicts, I think, first of all, to talk about the number of conflicts. So we are in a world at war, where no continent is spared wars, and the ICRC classifies conflicts based on legal criteria, and the number of conflicts has risen since the end of the Cold War. It is unprecedented. Now we have about 130 armed conflicts in about, involving about 60 states. That's not all states in the world, but still it's millions and millions of people suffering the consequences of those conflicts. And lately what we've seen is also that we're not just talking about non-international armed conflicts anymore, civil wars, but very much as well about conflicts between states. And that is, I think, a significant trend. And what it shows, probably first of all, is the casualness of the resort to force between states, the casualness with which force seems to now be a way to solve disputes, and the breakdown, or at least a huge pressure on Article 2.4, the prohibition of the use of force of the UN Charter. And it starts, the UN Charter is the Grundnorm of all of us, before human rights, humanitarian law, etc. And that is under huge strain. And again, it has consequences for people. And this is, I think, what, as humanitarians, we're always, of course, most worried about. With that, it means, because of the number of conflicts, the violations are also exponentially growing. And the challenge here, if you ask me what's the biggest challenge to international humanitarian law and the mission of the ICRC, which seeks to convince parties to uphold international humanitarian, has always been the discrepancy between the norm and what is on the ground. You said yourself at the beginning, Freddie, international humanitarian law has always failed to deliver for far too many people, even though it has also protected thousands and thousands of lives. Both of these things are true, but it's just not good enough that it has protected thousands and thousands of lives. We want it to deliver even more and to protect more people. Third aspect of this new challenge is, I think, a real risk of the normalization of total war. We have, when you look at the big conflicts, perhaps I'll still include Syria, because Syria, I think, was in a way a very significant conflict in terms of the trends. Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Gaza, now Lebanon, Iran, Sudan, the big conflicts that we think about, forgetting about all these other conflicts that we should be thinking about: Myanmar, Afghanistan, Colombia, South Sudan, DRC, which also cost millions of lives. Look at the characteristics of these conflicts. Huge numbers, unprecedented numbers, not unprecedented, but sort of in recent times, unprecedented numbers of death and wounded. Biggest numbers of displaced persons internally, as well as refugees, that we've ever had since the Second World War. I think extremely characteristic of these conflicts is the attacks and complete destruction of civilian infrastructure. We saw that in Syria. In Syria, water became a weapon of war, if I can say it in a very non-legalistic term, and you see this now in all these recent conflicts. The first thing that you see is just attacks on civilian infrastructure. And this is not about objects. It's about essential services to human beings. It's about being able to deliver food and water, medical care, the basics to people. And this is really an aspect, I think, of total war, of total destruction, of everything that the enemy relies on. Also something that Sultan talked about, the dehumanization of the enemy, which we saw so starkly as well in Syria, we see in South Sudan, in other places, Myanmar. The dehumanization of the enemy, which we as ICRC, who are very much involved, of course, in detention, see very much as well in the treatment of people who are caught in detention, the mistreatment, the lack of basic care, the incommunicado detention, the impossibility of families to know the fate of their loved ones, the huge numbers of missing persons. They augment in our database of the ICRC every year. The exponential power of technology, And we saw that just a couple of 4 weeks ago again in Iran, with artificial intelligence making its way into targeting. We see it in the autonomy, the increasing autonomy of weapon systems, where basically we are now also deciding to keep the human out of control of conflicts with an absolutely sanitized discourse that the future of conflict will be machines fighting machines. Well, that would actually be great, you know? I would love that if machines were fighting machines. The fact is that war is about killing people. And technology in the battlefield will just lead to death and injury as well. And if you look at all the conflicts that I cited, you can see that. Another characteristic are the attacks on humanitarian personnel and medical personnel, not just collateral, but deliberate attacks on this. We at the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement have lost many people in the past years. The worst has been in the Sudanese context, but also, of course, Gaza. Now already in the Iranian conflict, in the conflict involving Iran, has already claimed the lives of some colleagues of the Iranian Red Crescent and the Lebanese Red Cross, as you know, who are always heroically, really heroically on the front line trying to help people, are paying this with their lives. So I think when I say total war, it's really because the core tenet of international humanitarian law, which all states have signed up to, is that war is meant to affect the military might of the enemy, and all of international humanitarian law is about sparing civilians from the hostilities. And this has been completely turned on its head with the wars as they are fought today. And against this, and I mentioned this background, and I know it's a factual thing, it's not a legalistic point, but I think it's so important to always say this is what international humanitarian law is about. Is when we talk about international humanitarian law, we have to keep this in mind. And against this background, we have a paradox, which is that never has international law been so much, I think, on the minds of states, and in that I would actually disagree with Hans-Jörg. It depends what you mean by no one cares. It is invoked all the time. Never have we had so many cases in the docks of the International Court of Justice. Never have we had so much activity of the International Criminal Court. Never have we had so many cases of universal jurisdiction where actually war criminals are being prosecuted. We even have first cases now of companies involved in conflicts being brought before courts. And this, I think, is very good, and it shows that international law still has a very huge, not only legal, but also moral force. It matters that international law is violated or not, and this we have to hold on to. This is important. But the paradox that it leads to is that states at the same time are all saying all the time that they are abiding by international law. And so they are justifying the unjustifiable under that body of law, which means that by their interpretation, they are completely hollowing out the norms and turning them on their head. And that is coupled with two things that make it even worse. One is the selective invocation of international humanitarian law, and no state is spared from its double standards invocation of international humanitarian law, which is an extra strain on the corrosive effect. And this to me is, I think, something that I'm thinking about more now. I don't know if it's always been so stark. It seems to me, but I don't have no evidence for it, that it is starker is the silence in the face of these violations and of these justifications. That is, there is a legal argument to be made to say we could completely destroy this hospital. This water infrastructure is a military, we are justified in targeting these, electricity plants and so on. And the silence is deafening in the face of it. And this, I think, is where I think we'll have a second round where we'll talk about what do we need to do. But just to introduce that, I think we need to come back to the core tenet, to the object and purpose of international humanitarian law, and remember that behind the norms are values, and we need to go back to those.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a sobering assessment. And I think there's a common thread that I'd like to pick up with what Sultan was saying also about silence and speaking out. And I think that's a big challenge for humanitarian actors. But I'd like to turn to you, Dr. Fatou. Without the promise of accountability and justice, humanitarian assistance risks being just a fig leaf. From your perspective, at the ICC, how do you understand the attacks on humanitarian principles in IHL and what it means for both humanitarian and legal actors? How did you see this evolving when you were at the ICC, and how do you think things have changed in the last few years?
Thank you very much. Of course, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to come. I'm very pleased to be here. But thank you for your question. I think the concern that is reflected in that question goes to the heart of the present moment. Humanitarian action is, of course, indispensable because it seeks to preserve life and to alleviate suffering and uphold a minimum of human dignity in circumstances of extreme violence. But humanitarian action alone cannot and should never be expected to carry the entire burden of moral and legal order on its own. It is not a substitute for accountability. It is not a substitute for legal restraint. And it is certainly not a substitute for justice. So when one says that without the promise of accountability, humanitarian action risks becoming only a fig leaf, I understand that as a warning against allowing relief efforts to stand in place of responsibility. Humanitarian actors may save lives, and they do save lives, and that work, the work that they do, is, of course, indispensable. But if the legal and the moral framework that should restrain conduct is steadily weakened, then humanitarian action risks being left to respond to the consequences of abuse without any corresponding insistence that such abuse must answer to the law. My perspective is that the attack on international humanitarian law and on humanitarian principles today is troubling, not only because violence occurs, but also violators of law in armed conflict are, unfortunately and regrettably, they are not new. What is especially troubling is that the authority of the norms themselves appear increasingly strained. We are seeing not merely breaches, but a more profound challenge to the seriousness with which the rules are regarded, in which the rules are defended and applied. And in some quarters, principles that should remain universal are treated as though their force depends on circumstance, or that it depends on interest or political alignment. And that is deeply damaging development, because the strength of humanitarian law lies precisely in the fact that it is not meant to be conditional. For humanitarian agencies, the implications are immediate and they're practical. Their work depends upon a minimum recognition that there are limits in war, that civilians and those no longer participating in the hostilities are entitled to protection, and that humanitarian assistance must not be obstructed arbitrarily. When respect for these principles erodes, the operational space for humanitarian work becomes narrower and more uncertain, and access may become harder to secure. Neutrality may be more readily questioned, and the legitimacy of humanitarian action may become under pressure from actors who themselves insufficiently committed to the principled restraint. So in such circumstances, humanitarian agencies are asked to work in environments where the normative ground beneath them have become less stable. So for legal actors, the implications are different in form, but no less serious in consequence. The law depends not only on the existence of rules and institutions, but on confidence in their credibility, consistency, and their impartial application. If legal principle is treated as negotiable, or if accountability appears uneven in its force, then trust in the integrity of the system is definitely weakened. And that affects not only the institutions, but also victims and affected communities, for whom the meaning of justice depends in part on whether they are reasonably believed that law remains more than mere form of rhetoric. I would also say that humanitarian actors and legal actors should not be seen as occupying wholly separate spheres of concern. Their mandates are, of course, distinct, we all know that, and their methods are also distinct, but they are connected in a common underlying premise, and that premise is that human dignity must remain protected even in the midst of war, and that there are limits beyond which conduct cannot be normalized. Humanitarian action responds to immediate suffering, and legal accountability addresses responsibility, recognition, and the preservation of principle over time. So one should not ask to replace one with the other. As to how this attack has evolved in recent years, I would put it in very careful terms. The pressure on these norms has become more visible and has become more sustained. And in some settings, it is even more difficult to counter with a common language of restraint. The cumulative effect of repeated crises is that erosion can now even begin to appear as normal, ordinary. And that is one of the great dangers of the present moment. Not only that norms are violated, but that repeated strain can dull the sense of urgency with which violations ought to be met. And once that happens, the decline is no longer merely operational or legal. It becomes moral as well. And that is why clarity is important. Humanitarian action and accountability must not be treated as alternatives. It's together. And they serve different, but they also serve complementary purposes. Humanitarian action responds to immediate human need, and accountability affirms that grave harm is neither invisible nor consequence-free. If the protection of human dignity is to remain credible, then both of them must be defended.
Thank you very much indeed. And I'd like to come back later to that question of complementarity and how that can work in practice. But finally, Dr. Lina, this conversation, Geneva looms large in this conversation, as does New York and the Security Council. And sometimes it feels like a very Western-dominated discussion. How do key power brokers in the Asia-Pacific region understand these debates and these dynamics? And how different do they feel and look from where you sit than where we often tend to come at this from as humanitarians?
Thanks, Freddie. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizer for having me. And it's really a great pleasure to join these very important and timely discussion. Yesterday I was joking with Freddie that I saw not many Asian faces here. I guess even fewer Chinese faces. And I know the mention of China's role in this type of work can trigger a lot of discussion, debates, etc. Well, I myself I'm not very good at dealing with this kind of controversies or debates. So I had a safe solution is to focus on maybe my Southeast Asian experience, to talk about disasters there and how people responded to disasters. But unfortunately, I found Ibu Adlina and a few other Southeast Asian colleagues as speakers, and then I realized I don't have a safer choice. I have to touch on the more controversial, I wouldn't say controversial, unknown or less known player in this space. And then I have a thought. Actually, I have experience or some perspective to offer. As a Chinese who work and stay in Southeast Asia for a long time, really a very long time, who read a lot about academic and policy publications about humanitarian work or crisis-related issues or debates, I feel I generally understand the discourse. On the other hand, as a Chinese, I naturally read and hear about what happened in China. So I feel I have an interesting combination to shape my perspective or my unique lens. Of course, I can't represent anyone, but I still have my 2 cents to contribute to this discussion. First of all, with regard to perspective about the debates going on in the world, in Geneva, in New York. I would say, first of all, that the care for people, the awareness or the moral understanding to alleviate people's suffering. I believe this is universal. Every culture has that. It's I believe it's our human nature. With regard to humanitarian law, as my distinguished panelists mentioned, this is also what mentioned by the Chinese government officials during their remarks at different occasions. Recently, China, together with Brazil and a few other countries, had this global initiative to galvanize political commitment to international humanitarian law. So there is this commitment to uphold IHL, I believe not just from China, but other Asian or Southeast Asian countries as well. And then a third point I notice is that the relevance of the multilateral system in the discussion related to humanitarian response. It's repeated or stated by the Chinese government and officials. And in practice, humanitarian or multilateral humanitarian system is also what the Chinese government goes to when they need to respond or get involved in more complex situations where they are not so comfortable with or not having enough experience yet. Here I refer to like conflict situations. And then a third point I notice is about their focus on addressing the what they often call the root causes of all these crises. And from their perspective, whether we agree with it or not, it's a lack of development. So focusing a lot on economic development, provision of livelihoods, it's not just their rhetoric. This is what also they do domestically. So solving people's immediate needs. Of course, rights, then there is a different interpretation of rights. I will talk about it later. And then Another point, very interesting point I noticed is that discussion here focus a lot on conflict situations, which is rightly so, given that the regions facing conflict-induced humanitarian challenges are so near to Europe or this part of the world. Well, in the Asia Pacific, the picture is a little different. Of course, there is a violence there, communal violence or domestic violence. But overall, that region has witnessed relative peace. So the discussion related to humanitarian response is more focusing on climate change or respond to disasters. Just 1 or 2 weeks ago, actually, there is a national forum within China about reducing climate-induced risks. And then they have a forum specifically focusing on how to make their social response or non-governmental response group more professional. And then how to make their response more technologically enabled. So as you can see, that the discussion within China is quite different from what we are talking about here today, because the context is different, so it's naturally different. And then I will also say the social context or the soil is different. So you can't expect the same kind of mindset or mentality. So the first very important difference is who are humanitarian actors. The state, of course, is political in a very strict sense. They are not humanitarian actors, but they are important players or actors when we respond to disasters. In Chinese context, at least. Yesterday, the German Red Cross colleague Christoph Jonen, right? He mentioned when you talk about German people in times of disasters, they will immediately associate with like Caritas or these or NGOs or religious group. So at that time, the first idea come to my mind was if I talk about this or mention disaster to Chinese people, at least the majority of them, what kind of actors will come up in my mind? For example, my parents. So who is the first actor they will associate with? My answer is the government. This is true. They have this, they call it community office, which is of course affiliated with government. They will go to people in need, vulnerable groups for what they need, and then how they can help them. And the second, in times of disaster, you will often see images about the PLA soldiers carrying people across floods and helping them out of infrastructure, buildings in danger, etc. So this is how they see response to disasters. And then the second one is the rights to, what are human rights? So in the Chinese discourse, they often, or they always emphasize these rights to development, to livelihoods. Without life, without food, without all these essential needs being satisfied. So what's the point about talking something else? For example, political rights, civil rights, etc. It's not saying that these are not important, but they prioritize, or there is a list of priorities. And then that's also explain why Chinese aid is often like infrastructure focusing. And another very important, interesting difference I noticed, it doesn't mean that which one is better or which one is worse, but then the balance of the relationship between individual needs or individual rights and collective goods. The example I associate with is the Chinese response to COVID-19. Nowadays, we don't mention or talk about it a lot anymore. However, at that time, for a considerable period of time, there were very strict restrictions. And then it did cause a lot of inconvenience at some point of the 3 or 4 years course. However, the many senior citizens or vulnerable people with very serious health issues survive that crisis. For example, for my parents who are in their 70s, they didn't really feel the impact of the pandemic until it went to the very last maybe few weeks. Most of the time, they were able to move freely and they didn't get COVID until I believe end of 2022 or 2023 when it's about to open up. So that's the difference. And then the third one is whether disaster response or humanitarian response is a technical issue or it's a normative issue. So I feel in that context, they often, in Chinese discussion, they focus more on the technical aspect rather than involving in the normative debates. And then I feel regardless of the differences I mentioned, I would also like to highlight that China is not so different in some respect. For example, in recent years, they established aid agency, which is similar to GIZ in Germany and a few other countries. And then they have Red Cross, and then they have growingly active social groups, that's what they call, or non-governmental response groups. They responded to disasters overseas, and they have become more coordinated, more professional over the years. If you compare 2015, when they responded to Nepal earthquake, to the Turkey earthquake a few years ago, they have become more coordinated and more professional. So there are these kind of groups, very active there, responding to disasters, but not engaging in the policy debate yet. And then there is a small but growing community of academics. And then young people are increasingly aware of the discussion, although not in a very big group, but there is this dynamics going on within China. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, and I thank you for going to a more uncomfortable place, and I'd like to pick up in a moment on some of those sort of changes that you flagged at the end there. But I just want to give us a chance to come back to this question of what do we do? Can this race towards a kind of pretty stark picture of a collapse in norms be stopped? How? And what should the humanitarian sector do about it? I think there are threads in everything that you've said so far, but so hopefully we can pick up on some of those. So starting with you, Sultan, where do you see opportunities? If we're in one of the things we hear a lot about is that we're in a more transactional age. And in a more politically negotiated system, a more explicitly politically negotiated, is there room for more honesty? Is there room to close this gap that Cordula spoke about between rhetoric and reality? Do you see spaces where humanitarians can be more proactive?
Okay. I was most hopeful when we started the discussion about regionalism and localism, on localization, and I did some of those reflections and writings about localization at the time. But I'm a little bit disappointed, I think, at the moment in the way we implemented the agenda and we pushed it forward. Again, focusing on the practicality and the financial side and not addressing the normative and what these people should really be doing for themselves and how you can strengthen organizations within the country and so on. But maybe still the hope is to do so, is to expect everyone to be the first responder within their own context, be it in Europe, in America, in the Middle East, and so on. And if I were to maybe look at it from a Middle Eastern perspective, I think where we are not doing enough is in picking our own responsibility within the Middle East, within the Arab states in particular, to respond to crises that we face. We're very good to mobilize when the United States says mobilize, or when they give us something attractive to follow, but we're not good to mobilize around a humanitarian agenda. And despite the limited progress that has happened in terms of engaging in the debate about humanitarianism and so on in the Arab world, and as you know, I set up the center in Doha, Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies, a few years ago. It was the first center ever to be able to speak publicly about these issues. We still have a lot to do. We need to work on designing regional instruments and legal instruments, practical and so on, where we can keep our problems within our boundaries and pick up our responsibility towards them, and not use our problems as a pressure against our neighbors, be it in Europe or elsewhere. Because what that did is alienated a lot of what could have been goodwill support coming from Europe. It's become strategic support. And we saw that in Syria. Either you give us money or we'll push more Syrians towards you, be it the Turkish government at the time or the Syrian government, Assad and so on. That does not help. We must understand that we're all in this globe. We're not going to go anywhere. And we have to look after our neighbors and hinterlands and integrate with them as much as possible. So I would say for our regional perspective, we need to start working on our own instruments, and we need to use our own mechanisms for our own benefit first. For example, zakat money. Now it's very attractive amongst the UN agencies. Everybody has set up a zakat fund. They want to milk the possibility of religious Muslim people giving money, but under their control. Well, why can't they give their people directly? And the most important obstacle is where I started, is the lack of trust, is the dehumanization of these communities, is the fact that we think we really ought to take their money off them, but we decide how we can spread this money, and we have to use the dollar finance transitional channels. Therefore, it has to be all 100% kosher before it gets to anybody. That defeats the purpose of an immediate response where the need exists. And I don't know enough about the situation in China, but I think in our societies everywhere there is this sort of immediate community arrangement where people respond at the first stage, but they lack resources, they lack coordination, they lack these instruments that they need to work around. So I see that as one area where we can develop. We pick up more responsibility for ourselves, and the price is going to be high regardless, whether we do it ourselves or we wait for somebody else to do it for us, who will arrive too late, will cause a lot of problems, will leave a lot of unwanted, impossible to recycle material, all sorts of issues that you probably all know about major relief efforts. So that would be, I think, number one.
Briefly.
And now, on the opposite side, and I think particularly within Europe, and I was very encouraged in recent steps taken by European countries distancing themselves from those who are spoiling the international order, or some of them at least, is that we need to put more pressure on politicians. And I think we need to be less shy of speaking the truth where it matters. Either we do it, all of us together, or if we're going to specialize, so say agency A and agency B is about reaction and access, then we should all collectively support agency Z when they speak out. But the way it is now happening haphazard, and we don't really work collectively, does not help. So I think there is space for that, including building more and more trust between Middle Eastern agencies that are becoming more and more important. And very importantly, some of them are becoming more and more independent. If you look at Turkish IHH, I don't know if you're familiar with it, I don't know the exact name for it in Turkish, but it's probably one of the few organizations in the world that works with huge budgets, totally raised out of individuals, membership of Turkish civilians, businesses, local business. They don't take a penny of their government. Now that model is now eroding in the West, and I think we need to try and capture it back again.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sultan. Cordula, if I can turn to you, that we've actually already heard, I think, Dr. Lina mentioned the global initiative on IHL that the ICRC has been putting together. And I wonder if you can reflect on the global initiative, what it's trying to achieve, particularly politically, and how it might be a model for the kind of actions that humanitarian actors can be taking in the face of these challenges.
Yeah, and I think the premise here and the starting point for us is that, you know, at the end of the day, if we want to reduce the suffering of people from armed conflicts, first of all, we need to work much more on peace. And second, we need to put the responsibility back on states and parties to conflicts. It's their obligation to protect civilians and to spare civilians from the fightings. It's not the obligation of humanitarian actors. And I think the initiative's starting point is really that it is states' responsibility to come back to an attitude of better respect for international humanitarian law. And that responsibility at the multilateral level has to go through a political commitment. It cannot be left to lawyers or humanitarians. A bit in the sense of what you were just saying about holding politicians to account. I wouldn't perhaps, so it's not so much about perhaps politicians as such, but it's the political level of states. And so, and it has to be universal. It can't just be, you know, 2 or 3 states trying to uphold international humanitarian law, and with, you know, with all the admiration I have for efforts of states like Norway or Switzerland, it's just not sufficient. International humanitarian law belongs to everyone. And so we started an initiative with 6 states around the world that are not representative, of course, of their regions, but to symbolize the fact that we need to have a multiplicity of states launching this initiative and then joining the initiative. And so the 6 states were Brazil, China, that you just mentioned, Jordan, Kazakhstan, South Africa, and France. And these 6 states, interestingly, immediately said, yes, this is what we need to do, invited all states to join this initiative. And the initiative has a terrible title, I have to confess. It's called the Global Initiative to Galvanize Political Commitment for International Humanitarian Law. So it's a horrible title, but the point is the political commitment part of it. This is not about having discussions about you know, technical issues. It is also about technical issues, but it is about galvanizing political commitment. We have now, and the initiative is, in terms of substance, around 7 work streams, 3 of which are very much about what ultimately will change respect for international humanitarian law, which is preventive action. We need prevention, prevention, prevention. It starts at home. We need training of the armed forces. We need national implementation of the Geneva Conventions, and so on and so forth. And then we have 4 work streams that are really about the big issues, or some of the big challenges. There are others, but we need to make choices, basically, of contemporary armed conflicts. The protection of hospitals, the protection of civilian infrastructure, the use of information and communication technologies in armed conflicts, and naval warfare. And when we launched the initiative 1.5 years ago, some people said to us, naval warfare sounds a bit niche. Well, it isn't. So we now have over 100 states that have joined the initiative. The last one was Mauritania, I think, a couple of days ago. So we have over 100 states that have formally joined the initiative, which is amazing. And we have, for each of these work streams, we have altogether 27 co-chairs. So it's really not an ICRC technical initiative. It belongs to states. It was launched by states. It belongs to states. Because, again, it is their responsibility. And we've had state consultations on these work streams with recommendations, practical recommendations on how can we improve respect. And we've had over 150 states coming together And I think the specificity of the initiative is in the process. Because it was sort of incentivized by the ICRC, we followed the non-political, non-contextual way of doing it. And we said to states, we understand you all have your conflicts and your violations that you are particularly worried about, and you want to call out the violations committed by your enemies or the friends of your enemies, etc. This is not what this initiative is about. We all know what we're talking about, but we can come together, we have to come together as international community to talk about our understanding, and you have to speak out about your understanding of what it means to protect hospitals, your understandings that civilian infrastructure is not military infrastructure and cannot be targeted in a non-politicized and non-contextual way. Everyone will understand what you're talking about, but it makes it much easier. And it's quite a unique forum where we've had over 150 states really engaging in it. I've never seen so many states express very serious, very sophisticated views on international humanitarian law. And that makes a body of state pronunciations that are really, when you look at them in their great majority, very protective. This is what we have to build on. It will culminate at the end of 2026, probably December 2026, in a high-level meeting in Jordan, hosted by the 6 founding states, of course hosted by Jordan with the 6 founding states, inviting all states to come together to reaffirm this political commitment to international humanitarian law and to change the course of conflicts as they are now. So all states are invited to come at the highest level and to make that commitment clear.
Thank you very much indeed. And I think in the context we're talking about, it's an extremely important initiative, and just the fact of bringing these states together is critical. Of course, we come back to the gap, and the gap around accountability. And Fatou, you spoke, I think, very powerfully about the need for legal actors and humanitarians to see themselves as complementary and work together. I was part of conversations yesterday afternoon here, and this is something that I know is in the wider discourse, a lot of concern around neutrality, around how do humanitarians navigate that space. What would be your reflections on recognizing this is not humanitarians' responsibility, but what can humanitarians do more to play that role in driving accountability, and what would you like to see humanitarian actors stepping up to do more of?
Thank you very much for that. Of course, as I said in my initial response about humanitarian action and law complementing each other. But I think that at the moment, what is more on people's minds is that whether we believe that actually law can shape power. This is something that really it's on everybody's mind because of what currently is going on. And I'm not being an optimist, but I do think that law can still shape power. And we should work on that. But I also say that with realism and not with illusion. Because we all know that law has always never operated in a world that is free from politics or unequal influence or even strategic interest. So, and the interaction between law and power has always been complex. So the real question, in my view, is not whether power affects the environment in which law operates, because it clearly does. We have seen that now in everything that is happening around us. And the deeper question is whether we are prepared to accept that power should define the final limit of what is lawful and what is legitimate, as well as what is accountable, what it requires. And I do not believe that we should accept that. I continue to believe that law can shape power, because law does something that power alone cannot legitimately do. Law establishes standards that are meant to apply beyond convenience. It distinguishes between force and legality. It provides a framework within which conduct may be judged, obligations identified, and the violations that are done, we see it named. And it preserves the principle that even in circumstances of armed conflict or political intensity, there remains limits that are not meant to dissolve merely because they are inconvenient to the powerful. So law, for me, shapes power by shaping legitimacy. So even where compliance is contested and legal standards still matter because they help define what can properly be defended and what cannot, they compel the actors, they compel states, and they compel institutions to situate themselves in relation to norms that they cannot simply erase by assertion. So in that sense, I believe that law remains a form of restraint, not only in the narrow judicial sense, but in a broader moral and political sense as well. So therefore, I will say it matters because it provides the language of responsibility. And without law, grave wrongs risks being reduced to competing narratives or even political claims or the language of necessity. I think today we are seeing that happening a lot. And law insists on something more rigorous. It insists that there are duties, that there are standards, that there are consequences, and that the suffering of victims is not to be treated merely as an unfortunate byproduct of events beyond scrutiny. I'm depending on law because I still think that even with humanitarian work, the law, of course, is still very, very relevant. But at the same time, one has to be candid because power can and does pressure the legal order. And currently, we are seeing that happening, even at the ICC. It has happened before. As you know, I was sanctioned during my time, but it is happening now. And today, you find that I think about 9 staff of the ICC, 8 or 9 staff, have already been sanctioned. So it can influence the conditions in which law is interpreted, or is defended and is enforced. It can expose inconsistencies, and it can test also institutional independence. It can exploit the weakness where consistency is lacking. And when legal principles appear to be defended unevenly, and I put emphasis unevenly, the authority of the system is undeniably weakened. And this is not a trivial concern. I believe this is one of the central challenges of our time today. So, but acknowledging that reality is not the same as conceding that law has ceased to matter. Nor is it the same as accepting that power has replaced law altogether. In my view, that would be too absolute a conclusion and it would surrender too much. So the fact that law is challenged does not render it meaningless. On the contrary, it demonstrates why the defense of legal principle remains very necessary. And perhaps maybe the better way to understand the present moment is to say that power continues to test the resilience of law. It may distort the conditions in which law operates. It may even reveal the weakness in enforcement or inconsistency. But the answer to that cannot be withdrawal from legal principle. We cannot do that. It must be greater seriousness in defending it. It must be greater consistency in its application. And it must be a refusal to allow convenience to become the measure of legality. So my answer is this. Law still does shape power, though not automatically and not without contest. But it does so by setting standards, by preserving the distinction between force and legitimacy, by affirming that the powerful are not beyond legal scrutiny, and by keeping alive the principle that human dignity is not contingent upon political advantage. Power may test the law, certainly, but it should not be permitted to define justice.
Thank you very much indeed. So finally, Lena, and I do want to give a chance for a couple of people to come in with questions, but just to kind of pick up where I think you left off, talking about some of the similarities between the Chinese context and elsewhere. And I think if we're moving out of a period of Pax Americana, however we might understand that term, and however we might understand the future, but for those who are asking the question at least, how will China see their role in shaping a new order, if there is to be one? What would you, where do you think there may be opportunities or fruitful areas of discussion to be had with actors in China or around the Chinese context?
I can see that there has been a lot of discussion about China's expanding role or expectation to see China plays a greater role. And on the other hand, the reality is that they are still not so familiar with responses to conflict situations. Of course, they offer aid, emergency relief items through bilateral and multilateral mechanisms, etc. However, overall, you'll see their responses to natural disasters or natural hazards have been more developed or more mature. So I guess that the next step to inform or encourage a greater role of China in more complex situations, I guess first of all, sustained communication through multiple channels or at different levels are necessary. Of course, dealing with ministries it's not easy. I guess it's the same. It applies to governments everywhere. It's not easy. So a bottom-up approach would help to build these awareness. Actually, this morning, I talked to another participant about the development of area studies within China's academic circle. So it bears some similarity. I noticed that area studies in Europe started maybe 100 or even 200 years ago when they became curious about the nearby adjacent regions. So they have scholars going to Middle East and Africa to understand that part of the world. Of course, it's related to interest. And then during the Cold War, you see the thriving of area studies in the United States and USSR, and it's also driven by strategic interests. And then for China, of course, there have been studies on area, other regions, but it's never been given a quite important role. However, in past 5 or 6 years, this discipline has been elevated to the first degree discipline within the Chinese education system. It shows its importance. So the studies of development or humanitarian issues there has not been there yet. It will take a long time, but there is a tiny community or growing community there. So I guess interaction can start from there, and they have channels to have conversation or inform their policymakers. And there is this school called International Academy of Red Cross within Suzhou, and then there are academics there, and there are some ministry-affiliated think tanks who started working on development aid, humanitarian aid issues a few years or about some time ago. So there is this community growing. Actually, yesterday or the day before, there was an event about humanitarian, or how to reset the humanitarian system. So I think it's very important to have more international actors to share their perspective, to engage or encourage a greater role. And on the other hand, it takes an organization like IFRC, this initiative about IHL, to demonstrate that there is opportunity or time for other non-Western countries to shape a new type or set of principles or norms and that fit for the context of nowadays. Because the previous rules, norms worked for some period of time. However, obviously the context has changed. So it's important to demonstrate these non-Western countries then now is the time for them to speak out. Otherwise, then the rules will be set again without their voices reflected. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I think that's a really important point to end on. Okay, so we have a little bit of time left in the session. So I just want to open it up, really. I'm sure there are a lot of thoughts. I think we only have time for a couple. I'll ask you to keep it brief so that we can hear from others. I don't know if I can see some hands over here. Maybe, I don't know, the gentleman, yeah, closest to you? Exactly. And then maybe behind, after. We'll see how we do.
All right, thank you very much. My name is Jeff. I'm a MEO specialist and a NOHA alumni. And thank you very much for all the very insightful thoughts you've shared. I wrote my question down, so I'll just read from here. So I think Dr. Cordola, you mentioned something along the lines of organizations coming together to make a commitment. And however, we know that the enforceability of international humanitarian and human rights law has always been a challenge and an issue, perhaps even a gap or a loophole. And so what guarantees are there that these states will not just make these commitments for the uptakes and still go about violating them? And because in some cases you only have some representatives of these countries attending these meetings and making these commitments, and while they may represent the interest of their countries, it can be challenging to ensure that the commitments they make are agreed at the highest levels in the country. So there's probably no clear or direct answer to this, but it would be great to know what conversations are happening or going on along these lines. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. And then one behind.
Okay, thank you. So thank you for all your presentation today. I'm really glad to hear that so many different perspectives. And I'm a Chinese student who's nowadays studying in humanitarian action. So probably my question is especially for Dr. Lina Gong. So as someone who shared like the similar background with you, I believe me and with my other Chinese colleagues, we are really proud to see your participation here today. But just like when you mentioned about these COVID-19 policies in China, like as what we discussed with my other Chinese colleagues, I believe these policies are really different from different regions. So I just want to add one point that sometimes we probably should keep that diversity in policies in mind. And I'm curious whether there's sometimes a risk that avoiding controversy might also limit how deeply we engage with structural injustice in humanitarian work. Thank you.
Thank you. And maybe we can have one more. I want to look to this side of the room, but okay, we have one here.
Good morning, everyone. I have a question for my friend Lina Go. It's about China again. I had a question yesterday about exercising the leverage when dealing with China. And of course, as you know, ASEAN, I come from ASEAN, we have that leverage when dealing with China as well as other dialogue partners. You mentioned that when it comes to rights, Chinese government in particular would frame it more as economic and development rights, while the Western understanding of rights would be different from what the Chinese would feel. Do you think that, have you seen backlash over these differences? And how do we reconcile other human rights issues, such as, I know that this may be a very uncomfortable question, but you know that there are also violations of human rights in China, pointed out by the UN against Muslims in China. While you mentioned that rights are universal, how would the Chinese government see this? Are they seeing it more as a security and a stability issue rather than the basic human rights issue? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so maybe we can work backwards along the panel. And I think a question there around enforceability of IHL and how to close this gap. I think a question there around maintaining and recognizing diversity in policy and how to manage that moving forwards. And then also, I think a couple of issues there around being willing to engage on controversial issues. And I think a quite specific question there about the context of human rights and how human rights is understood and engaged with in China. But maybe I can ask you to provide any thoughts on those questions or any other reflections before we close for lunch, starting with you, Lina.
I thank you for the questions, and I'm very glad to know that there are Chinese students which are in the audience, which actually represent a growing interest or awareness of this conversation among the Chinese population. And I totally agree that policies need to actually reflect the social context, and it's different societies have different norms, different rules, and each will make their own choices. And also it is important to recognize that no policy will be perfect. And then with regard to Ibu Adlina's avoiding controversies will actually reinforcing systemic injustice. So I feel that's why I feel necessary to engage in an open discussion, recognizing the differences, and also in a word I find very interesting is positionality in social science study. So everyone has their unique lens. You can't avoid it. What's more important is be transparent about the differences, and second, respect the differences, and then find mitigating measures. Each side need to make some compromises. But then if we start by accusing or criticizing or demonizing or having a strong bias, then it will be very difficult to really have a frank, constructive discussion, and then to really benefit the system. Now, with regard to Ibu Adlina's question, I am not an expert on that issue. Then I feel it is very important to verify. So what are the truths, and then what are the reported stories. So that's my initial response to that point. And I feel criticisms of each government face that. So as mentioned earlier, like frank, honest conversation is a useful, helpful first step. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much indeed. Fatou.
I did not have a question as such, but I probably just want to say that international law will continue to be tested. There will be pushback all the time. And even if you look at history, you find out that most of the time that we've come up with all these big conventions and treaties is because something very serious had happened, and we come up with a convention. So I believe what we need to do at the moment is to recommit. We really need to recommit to the rules. We cannot say what your friend said yesterday about nobody gives a damn, and I just align myself with what you said, that we do give a damn. And indeed. And you find that when, for instance, an international criminal court arrest warrant is issued, you find those who are targeted avoiding places where they know they will be arrested. We have seen that. So it matters. Of course, people will say, I don't care, I will not do that, but they know at the end of the day, international law will play its role. So those of us who really want to see a just world, a more just world, we need to recommit. We need to recommit to the principles, because at the end of the day, what it's really saying is that every one of us has the right to dignity, to peace, to justice, and to accountability.
Thank you very much indeed. Cordula.
Hardly anything to add to this, I would say. But I do want to come back on this question of enforceability, compliance, which is the question of all international law, and in particular about international humanitarian law, because it matters so much to the lives of people, and it's a life and death decision. And the first thing to be able to live with is that there is no silver bullet of compliance. There will not be a switch, click on, click off. We find the silver bullet. If there was a silver bullet, we would have already found it. And so to go back to this recommitment, and there's one very important article which is common to the 4 Geneva Conventions. It's common Article 1 to the 4 Geneva Conventions, and it says that all parties, all high contracting parties, commit themselves to respect and ensure respect for international humanitarian law in all circumstances. And this means not only to respect international law in your own jurisdiction, which is the starting point, IHL starts at home, but also to ensure respect by all states and all parties to all armed conflicts around the world. It's what in international law we call erga omnes obligations, which means these are obligations that are owed to the international community as a whole, because they are so fundamental to the entire international community. And the International Court of Justice and others have repeated in several cases that this entails a responsibility of all states to bring those who are in violation of international humanitarian law back to an attitude of international humanitarian law. It requires all states to use their leverage, to use the influence that they have, and of course the influence varies depending on circumstances and depending on the relations that you have with the state. But the more economic leverage you have, the more military cooperation you have, the more weapons you ship to a party to a conflict, the higher your responsibility to also ensure that that party to the conflict complies with international humanitarian law. And I think this is something that we need to take far more seriously, and that all states in the world can contribute to, not just the parties to the conflict. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I think we need to do better documentation of all the violations of IHL, and to do it as be part of our daily work, and not worry about submitting those cases to courts and so on. I know this is a controversial issue for humanitarian agencies, but if you're there and you part of your added value is you are a witness, and people look up to you in that way. and as well as a protector. So if you witness and you're not able to document, then you're not really doing your job as a humanitarian, I think. The second one is we need to name and shame states and individual leaders when they go wrong. I think the most dangerous is to keep talking about all states and to try and generalize the harm that is being done. So you take some of the UN, and without mentioning any particular agency, they'd say there has been so many violations of human rights, or so many people, so many aid workers have been killed. But when you look at it really, there has been a particular state that has killed so many individuals, and in the most horrible, violent way. And we need to have the courage to say it and name it and shame it, so that those who have developed the habit of crossing the law do not go as far as sanctioning the institutions that are there to implement the law and to deliver justice. And finally, I think we need to worry about the poking of the dragon that is going on around the world. I think what is happening at the moment, trying to get China out of its comfort zone to be part of the wider politics, is extremely dangerous. This last war we're now living with Iran has nothing to do with Iran and the threat, the imminent threat, as you know, that Iran has posed to the United States or the West and so on. It is a lot to do with, obviously, Israel's agenda, but also to try and poke China, to get them to react and do more things. It started with the bombing of Nigeria first, then Venezuela oil, and now the Iranian oil. And we're waiting to see how far we can test their patience, their strategic patience. And I worry about that. Not for anything against the Chinese, except the fact that it's 1/5 of the world. And although we can criticize a lot of the humanitarian response within the country, we cannot deny the credit China has in having pulled down global poverty by and large. You know, we always talk about we've been successful around the world, but in fact, it is China who has been successful. We all claimed that success. So, yeah, I'll stop here. No
Thank you.
Politics.
Thank you so much. Well, look, I know we're standing between everyone and lunch, so I'll be very quick. I just want to say a huge vote of thanks to this fantastic panel of experts. I think the conversation has confronted the challenges we face in stark terms, but I've also found it personally heartening. I think it's reaffirmed the importance of law, the importance of aspiration towards law, and the fact that it does still matter. And I think it's also pointed, yes, to the challenge for the humanitarian sector, but also the opportunities and some of the actions that organizations can take upon themselves. And I hope that all of us who work for different organizations can take away a reflection on what kind of a role we play in pushing forward this agenda, because it matters to everybody's work. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you for being with us, and thank you to the organizers.